Hello, everyone. Thank you for having me. I'm just going to share a few slides because it just makes it a little bit easier. So can you see that? Yes, I've got a nod. Okay. So I've come into this kind of request relatively late. So forgive me if you already know lots about SWEP. I'm just going to kind of go over a little bit of it and then go about our toolkit from there. So my name's Chris. I'm from Homeless Link. We are a national infrastructure organisation, kind of membership organisation for voluntary sector and local authorities working in housing and homelessness. Here to talk about SWEP, which is Severe Weather Emergency Protocol. Essentially, it's a humanitarian response rather than a legal response to severe weather and getting people off the streets. There's a Pan-London agreement where every local authority signs up to SWEP, and nationally every local authority does. But as I say, it's not actually a legal requirement. And essentially, what it consists of is it could be any severe weather. So we're talking about extreme cold, we're talking wind, snow, rain, heat. Generally, it will be put in place over the winter months when the weather gets to 0 or below for 3 or more days. These tend to be when it's called in. But we have been hearing a bit more over the summer months where the heat has been going over a certain level as well. But I'm here to talk more about the cold today. So as I said, it's kind of a 3-night guideline. And what that means is everyone is looking at various different weather providers, but generally the Met Office is what people tend to look at. But yeah, 0 or below in 3 different areas. Now we have across London, we have the local authority approach. So each local authority will have their own protocol in place and is recommended to do so. This tends to be led kind of by housing directors and commissioning team, but on the ground it's implemented by kind of street outreach, street population team, maybe the RSI, so the Rough Sleeper Initiative coordinator, and one of those roles with outreach will double up as the SWEP coordinator while it's in place. It's planned with a multi-agency approach. Public health tend to be involved, especially when we were thinking over COVID and the kind of the spaces that people were kind of communal hubs that people were in when it was SWEP. I haven't actually said it here, but essentially SWEP is if the weather hits 0 or below, everyone is provided with an offer off the streets. And that's essentially what it is. So it's always recommended, ideally, that people would have single occupancy accommodation. So quite often local authorities will book a certain amount of places in hotels, which they can action when SWEP is called. But that's not always the case. So whereas not a single occupancy, quite often a community hub where people can be brought overnight in more of a traditional kind of night shelter setting can also be used. And generally, anyone who is coming into interaction with someone that might be street homeless can refer in to that kind of SWEP coordinator. That tends to be done either via the outreach team, StreetLink, which is a national kind of helpline to report rough sleepers, can also be used, as well as kind of out of hours housing options teams or the housing options team if someone presents during the day. But unsurprisingly, there's quite a lot of people on the streets in London, and those kind of local bed spaces or that local provision is often filled up quite quickly. And actually, not all local authorities have that local provision. So if that local provision is filled up quickly, the local SWEP coordinator for that borough notifies St Mungo's, who help kind of run the Pan-London SWEP provision, or they also notify the GLA, the kind of homelessness and rough sleeping team there, when their provision is coming to be at its capacity. And at that point, you can refer to Pan-London provision. So for Pan-London provision, there is lots of hotels, community spaces, which have been booked in advance. Sometimes in previous years with really extreme prolonged weather, there has been really great effort to find extra places where people can be placed because actually there wasn't enough provision on Pan-London. And a lot of this planning goes in essentially once the winter months end. Planning for the following year tends to start again. And then there's just a little bit of information there kind of about flow and about how different local authorities can refer into the Pan-London. SWEP, One thing I wanted to mention was when basically SWEP tends to be kept open, as I say, as long as it's going to be 3 nights or more of below zero. If that was due to end on a weekend, it tends to be kept open till at least the Monday, so that people leaving SWEP can approach their local housing options. And on the Pan London protocol, the in for good principle is recommended, which essentially aims to minimise the number of people who return to rough sleeping after a SWEP placement. So there tends to be a lot more work done these days with actually finding some longer term placements, getting some real kind of assessments done when people are in SWEP, and really trying to find some more longer term suitable options for people. What I've done here is there is a link to the Pan London activation procedure, which I've sent to Emily, and there's also the guidance there as well, which is provided to local authorities. I've also sent our actual toolkit to Emily, so all of those she can send around afterwards. And then there's just a couple of little slides I won't spend too long on, but essentially, as you would imagine, the recommendation from national government, so DLUC, is around trying to provide single occupancy. However, there is that recognition that actually communal spaces need to be used. Essentially, it's about preserving life. SWEP, so where the lesser of two evils, so communal spaces being used when single occupancy is already used up. This is just some kind of ways that people can plan, and local authorities look at this, as I say, through the summer months when they're planning for the winter, using things like the Chain, which is a London rough sleeping database, taking a lot of data from there. The yearly snapshot counts, which have been happening in November, they'll look at the previous year's figures, general amount of street link referrals coming through, and local intelligence. And that's where that kind of multi-agency approach works, especially on a local authority level, listening to the partners on the streets, listening to food banks, listening to any voluntary sector organisations who know the amount of people that might be out there. And then the other key thing I wanted to mention was around communication. Basically, once SWEP is called, on a local level and a Pan London level, they want to inform as many voluntary sector organisations that might be working with people that are sleeping rough, as many as possible, so that actually they can get that referral in and everyone is notified when SWEP has been called. So if you feel that you know agencies, voluntary sector organisations that are working with homeless people that don't know about SWEP, I'm happy to make some introductions to kind of get you onto those relevant lists. And then I think that is about it. A bit of a whistle-stop tour.
Thank you. I think there's a couple of questions. Steve, you've got your hand up.
Well, John's questions in the chat, I think, are also very important, but I wanted to reflect on the experience that we had this last weekend when SWEP was activated, and I'm sure actually quite a few people on the call will have connected with that activation in some capacity or other. From our point of view, what the activation, so British Red Cross were very actively involved as a kind of a lead organisation, but as a community network, our connection with that is that 2 local authorities who set up group centres asked fairly late on in Friday afternoon for additional volunteers, and people did respond, and I think that they ended up being fully staffed, and that's credit to those organisations who were able to mobilise volunteers. But it does beg questions in my mind of whether were those the only 2 local authorities that set up group centres, or did other local authorities set up group centres but didn't ask for extra volunteers? And undoubtedly there will be more SWEP activations during the winter, and I feel I'm talking about because of our more informal networks as opposed to the kind of stronger networks from people like British Red Cross and React, we could learn from that and be better prepared if we knew which local authorities are likely to follow that protocol as opposed to individual accommodation. More information the better. As I say, this weekend it all worked out fine in the end, but it was a stretch, I think.
Yes, I guess I can't comment on every local authority. So the guidance we produce is for local authorities, and it's followed on the Pan-London level. What I would say is it all comes into the planning. And that's why we recommend planning really far in advance. And as you say, getting volunteers is really key for that. And actually having that bank of contacts in advance to be able to call upon is really important. As far as kind of how many local authorities are kind of doing group centres, I believe more and more are doing single occupancy, but actually on that Pan-London level, there is still some of the group ones are kind of called upon. So, and then that's all collated and organised by St Mungo's, where they have professionals working across those, as well as drawing upon some volunteers from their kind of networks. Sorry, I can't give a definitive answer, but what I would say here is if anyone's struggling to kind of make contact with their SWEP coordinators and find out information, I can chuck my email in the box, and I'm happy to kind of make some introductions and kind of make some links there if that's of any use. I think
that's a great offer. Becky, hand up.
Hi, Chris. Thank you. Really, really useful presentation. And I was just interested. So rather than my VCSEP role, my personal role as a volunteer with Street Vets, I was interested to know sort of what provision there is. Sorry, my dog is now in the background, asking to be taken for a walk. I was just interested in what provision there was. A lot of work done with street homeless, is hampered by the fact that they have a pet, often a dog. And that actually, they choose to be on the street with their pet rather than go into accommodation without their pet. And when it comes to SWEP, is there provision for that, or is there a consideration as to how that can or could be dealt with? Thank you.
Yeah, there is. If I'm honest, it tends to be more that kind of Pan-London offer. It tends to be the one used more for people with pets, and they do put some stuff aside for that. Now, one of the issues you can imagine with the Pan-London offer is if someone is sleeping rough in Bexley and the Pan-London offer is in, I don't know, Kensington and Chelsea, sometimes that means some people are less keen to go. But on that Pan-London level, they do look to have resources available so people with pets can go in. But that's not always the case on the local level.
Thank you, Chris.
Thank you. And Christina, I was hoping to hear from you anyway about your SWEP response. But
yeah, so I just wanted to kind of, in response to what Steve was saying, a little bit more information. So I was in conversation with Ben McDonnell from the GLA, who presumably you know, Chris. Over the last month or so, we were having a discussion about the fact that it was more likely that local authorities might need support with some of the communal accommodations this year than it may have been previously, and we were discussing what kind of support that we might be able to provide. And I know that Ben has been surveying local authorities to try and understand what that need might be, but this SWEP activation kind of came in a little bit earlier than expected. So some of that kind of planning work that was happening, kind of it wasn't finalised. So in this response, Ben put us in touch with some of the local authorities that had come forward to him asking for support. There were 3 local authorities. Well, actually, there were 2 that he put us in touch with, and a third that came through another local authority to us to ask for support. Some of those were earlier than others, and we were able to support some of them, which is why I guess for some partners in this space, it felt like the notification came quite late. It didn't for all of those local authorities. That would be unfair. Some of it was that we were already resourcing it. However, it was definitely a partnership response. We weren't able to kind of support it all, and I've got a meeting actually immediately after this one again with Ben to kind of just review what happened this time and think about that. And I think it is about that no single organisation necessarily, but actually how we kind of collectively can come together to support if there is need. But the numbers of volunteers required weren't that many. It was just, I think, the antisocial nature of the shifts that meant that, I mean, for us, quite a lot of volunteers couldn't do an overnight shift because they had work the next day, for example. So I think there are various factors to consider. And the other thing that we had been discussing was specifically around actually in support in these situations, the need for kind of an understanding and an awareness of the kind of the people we're supporting in their situation, how it might differ to some of the people we normally support within the kind of day-to-day work that we do. And so we'd been developing, or about to develop, a little bit of a kind of an awareness session for our volunteers. But I think there's definitely something in that kind of understanding of kind of that space and that cohort and how they're best supported that might differ to kind of the day-to-day that should be considered as well. But yeah, I've got a conversation with Ben after this meeting, so I'll keep you updated.
Yeah, Ben will listen. So Ben was involved with the GLA with everybody in COVID as well, so a lot of experience in kind of working around this. And as you say, a partnership approach is really key. And actually, it's with local authorities bringing in that partnership approach. Yeah, it's vital. I can see a couple of questions in the chat. Do you just want me to answer those quickly?
Yeah, that'd be great. Thank you.
So there's one from John. I guess what an ideal offer would be. An ideal offer would be, I guess, single occupancy accommodation where people could have access to support, as you say. Now, things like kind of health checks, vaccinations, laundry services. The nature of SWEP and how short term it is, I think maybe not necessarily all of those, but actually the idea of kind of making a lasting difference and actually making people get that advice and people can get access to services where they might not have had services before, and ideally not returning to the street. And then hopefully if you can prevent people going to the street and getting access to kind of longer term accommodation, you can bring in the things like the health checks and the vaccinations as well. So yeah, I think the ideal offer is essentially to make that longer term offer through this. And when we think about like Crisis of Christmas that kicks in with the day centres over the Christmas period, they're then placing people in accommodation for 2 weeks to 4 weeks. And again, it's that thing, once we're getting people in, homeless services really want to do some good intensive work with people to make a bit of lasting change. And then I could see one from Keith about the kind of local connection. Theoretically, if you're found in a borough under SWEP, that borough can place you. There's no requirement for local connection on that basis while SWEP is happening. I'm not to say, you know, sometimes those conversations don't necessarily happen on the ground, but they shouldn't really be. The recommendation is very much you get people off the streets. It's a humanitarian response, make them safe. You can figure that out later down the line and refer them to a different local authority if needs be.